You know, when you finish a great story, you expect a clear ending, right? A nice, neat conclusion.
Hmm.
But have you ever paused at the Gospel of John, chapter 21?
Well, is it really the final word? Or maybe, just maybe, something added on later?
That's a fantastic question, and it's exactly what we're diving into today.
We are. We're looking specifically at John chapter 21, and our main guide for this exploration is the brilliant New Testament scholar, Raymond Brown.
Exactly. We're really digging into Brown's analysis, mostly drawing from his big commentary in the Anchor Yale Bible series on John's Gospel, and also his work on the Johannine Epistles.
Yeah, the goal here is pretty focused.
Yep.
Let's unpack Raymond Brown's take on John 21. What did he think about, who wrote it? How does it fit with the rest of John?
And what are those key themes, those specific details he picks up on?
Right. So by the end of this, you should have a much clearer, more nuanced picture of this chapter, specifically through Brown's scholarly lens.
So first off, this whole question of whether John 21 was original, well, it's a classic debate. Brown jumps right into it. He doesn't shy away from it.
Not at all. He acknowledges, yeah, it could well be a later edition, maybe by someone close to the original author's circle, a redactor, as scholars say.
Okay, redactor.
But, and this is crucial for Brown, he insists it's deeply connected to the Johannine tradition. It's not some random piece just stuck on the end. It fits.
Okay, so if it was potentially added by a redactor, what does Brown think the point was? Why add it?
Well, Brown really zeroes in on John 21, verse 24. You know the verse. This is the disciple who's bearing witness to these things and who has written these things, and we know that his testimony is true.
Right.
Brown reads that as a very deliberate move by this later editor, perhaps, to really cement the beloved disciple as the ultimate authority behind the whole gospel.
Ah, okay. So even if it's an addition, it's serving to underline something already believed.
Precisely. Brown connects it back to John 19, verse 35, the witness at the cross whose testimony is true. He argues this idea that the beloved disciple is the guarantor wasn't just invented by the redactor. It was already there in the community's understanding.
That makes a lot of sense. It's like adding an author's note to clarify the source.
Sort of, yeah. It validates the whole account through this figure.
Okay, let's shift gears a bit to maybe the most famous part of chapter 21, that conversation between Jesus and Peter on the beach, Peter's restoration. How does Brown approach that?
Brown thinks this scene, especially John 21, 15 through 17, Jesus asking Peter 3 times, "Do you love me?" and telling him, "Feed my sheep." He thinks this likely preserves a really early, pretty reliable tradition.
An early tradition about.
About a specific resurrection appearance to Peter while Peter was fishing. He sees the big catch of fish just before this, as part of that same original story, the sign that helps Peter recognize it is the Lord.
And Peter jumping in the water.
Yeah, Brown notes that too. It emphasizes just how immediate and personal this encounter is. Real energy there.
And the 3 questions about love, obviously mirroring the 3 denials. What's Brown's view on the structure there?
He suggests that, while the scene might have been, let's say, dramatized a bit in the telling over time.
Shapes for impact.
Exactly. But the core idea, Jesus giving Peter this chance to reaffirm his love after the failure, Brown believes that was probably part of the Johannine tradition very early on. It's powerful stuff about forgiveness, about restoration.
It really is. And then the commission, feed my lambs, tend to my sheep. How does Brown interpret the significance of that for Peter's authority?
Oh, he sees the shepherd imagery as absolutely loaded with meaning.
How so?
Well, he draws lines back to the Old Testament, where God is the shepherd, leaders are shepherds, and even to texts found at Qumran. The point is, the shepherd figure wasn't just a nice poetic image.
Right, it meant something specific.
It signified divinely given authority, a delegation. Just like Jesus is the good shepherd in John chapter 10, Peter is now being commissioned to share in that shepherdly care for the community.
So it's a direct link to leadership.
Yes. Brown actually says, and I'm quoting roughly here, the figure of the shepherd is used in situations which emphasize that Israel's leaders share in divine authority and act as God's delegates. So it's about legitimate God-given responsibility.
Does he directly connect it to John 10's Good Shepherd passage?
He does, though he notes that some scholars, like Lazy, question that direct link. But Brown also brings in others, like Cassian, who argue for a very close thematic tie between the 2 passages within John's own narrative. For Brown, it clearly points to Peter's restored leadership.
That really deepens the meaning. It's not just forgiveness, it's reinstatement.
Exactly, reinstatement and commission.
Okay, what about the meal they share? The breakfast on the beach, John 21, 12 to 14. Any particular insights from Brown there?
Yeah, it's interesting. Brown notes that quite a few scholars view the phrase after they had eaten breakfast as maybe a slightly artificial link.
A bit clunky.
Perhaps, like a bridge built just to connect the miracle catch and the meal scene to the really crucial dialogue with Peter that follows. A narrative scene, maybe?
I see. Are there details within the meal scene itself that Brown finds significant?
Yes, a couple of things. He points out that it's only John's gospel that consistently names Peter's father as John. You get it back in John 1, verse 42, and here again in John 21:15.
Simon, son of John.
Right. Brown even briefly mentions a less common theory from Schwenk linking this to John the Baptist, but he doesn't seem to put much weight on it.
Okay. Anything else about Simon, son of John?
Well, Brown finds it noteworthy that Jesus uses Simon, son of John, rather than Peter right before the threefold question.
Why is that significant?
Brown suggests this more formal, perhaps less intimate address might be a subtle way of, well, challenging Peter, reminding him of his before self, maybe, in light of the denial he needs to overcome. It adds a layer to the restoration moment.
Wow, you really see how Brown digs into the textual details. Okay, let's move towards the end of the chapter. What about the part discussing the beloved disciples' lifespan? John 21:20-23. That dig can be confusing.
It definitely raises questions. Brown interprets this whole section as essentially the Johannine community reflecting on its own traditions and history, specifically concerning this central figure, the beloved disciple.
Reflecting how?
He proposes that this passage probably arose because the beloved disciple, who was maybe expected by some to live until Jesus' return, had actually died.
Ah, so it's addressing a potential crisis of expectation.
Kinda. It seems like the community is processing this reality. Their key witness has passed away and trying to understand it, maybe correcting a misunderstanding that had circulated based on Jesus' words.
So Brown thinks this part is the community grappling with its own story unfolding.
That seems to be his view. And interestingly, he links this section stylistically and maybe even authorially to the conclusion back in John chapter 20, verses 30 and 31.
The part that says Jesus did many other signs.
Exactly. Brown suggests both of these endings, or appendix-like sections, might come from the same later hand, someone very close to the original tradition, trying to frame the gospel and address later concerns.
Fascinating. Okay, so let's land on the final two verses, 24 and 25. How does Brown wrap it all up?
Well, verse 24 we touched on, this is the disciple. Brown sees this as the redactor's explicit stamp. The beloved disciple is the source, the witness, full stop.
And verse 25, the one about the whole world not being able to contain the books.
Right. Brown views that as a pretty standard literary closing for ancient works, a kind of flourish.
So not literally, meaning there are countless lost stories.
Not necessarily. More like a rhetorical way to say that the significance of Jesus's life and work is truly inexhaustible. It emphasizes the sheer scale and importance of the subject matter, which is a common trope.
Okay, so if we were to boil down Raymond Brown's view on John 21, what are the absolute key takeaways?
I'd say three things stand out. One, while it's likely a later addition, it's not alien. It's deeply rooted in the Johannine tradition.
Right, integrated.
Two, it serves vital theological purposes, especially restoring Peter and commissioning him, using that powerful shepherd imagery.
Leadership.
And three, it deliberately, explicitly points to the beloved disciple as the foundational witness behind the gospel. It secures the testimony.
So Brown helps us see it not just as an add-on, but as a crucial piece for understanding how the early Johannine community saw Peter, saw the beloved disciple, and ultimately saw the authority of their own gospel.
Exactly. It's a capstone, even if added later.
It really does give you a different perspective. Think about it. If you accept Brown's analysis that chapter 21 is later, but still authoritative, how does that shape the way you understand Peter's importance in the early church?
And what does it tell you about how vital that connection to the beloved disciple was for preserving this particular story of Jesus?
Does seeing it this way maybe change the impact or the message you take from the Gospel's ending? It's definitely something to mull over.
Absolutely. And look, if this discussion has sparked your interest, digging into Brown's actual commentaries on John is the next step. It's incredibly rich and detailed.
For sure. And comparing his views with other scholars always opens up even more perspectives on this really unique ending to the fourth Gospel.